Monday Night Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. Team of us, everyone in.
Now we're going to cast an eye largely on the Southern Hemisphere this evening. We have with us Matt Williams. Good evening.
Joey, how are you, mate?
Very well. You are quarantining, as I understand it.
I'm in a secret location in Dublin, being hidden away from you all. Yeah, mate, I'm on day 6 of quarantine, 8 to go, not that I'm counting. So I've flown in from Sydney where there was no cases for 11 days, but I've still got to lock myself away for 14 days. That's the way of the world. So it is what it is, mate.
And are you literally alone in the room for most of it, all of it?
Well, my wife's with me. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. She might be throwing things at us during this.
Our sympathies to her.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm glad she's here. It'd be pretty lonely if you were by yourself.
How?
But, we're in a room, and
okay.
You can go out to get some food, to buy food. That's about it. But you're not supposed to go out, which we don't.
Okay, tough. How was the flight? Were you mask on the whole flight?
Yeah, you got to wear a mask and a face shield the whole way for 24 hours. Not real pleasant. The flights were actually fuller than I thought they would be. They weren't packed, but they were maybe 2/3 to 3/4 full. So it was quite interesting. Yeah, very hard to get out of Australia. So it was hard to get in. When it hit, when you and I were working there on TV, I was stuck in France for almost 4 months. Couldn't get back to Australia till July, and then when the rugby started, I couldn't get back out. So that was a window popped up last Thursday Australian time, and that was we had like 24 hours to jump on it, because a lot of what they're doing is if they haven't got enough people on the flights, they bump them. So it was tough enough to get out. So we're here, and then 14 days. The world's changed, mate. The world has changed.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. No cases for 11 days, and Sydney's good going.
Sydney's doing really well. Well, Australia, Melbourne aside, and just Melbourne, not all of Victoria, Melbourne aside, has done exceptionally well. Western Australia, no cases for a long time. Queensland, no cases. South Australia, Northern Territory, no cases. And Sydney did 11 days. They've got a few today, which is a bit of a worry, but still only, I think it was 10. Don't quote me exactly on that number. I think they were worried there was a little flare up in a suburb around some restaurants and things. But Australia's doing particularly well apart from Melbourne. Melbourne's got it down to 15, and they just can't seem to budget. But the semi-finals of the Rugby League are going ahead with 50% of the people in the stadiums this weekend. Semi-finals of the AFL are going ahead in Brisbane. It'll be full house there at the Gabba. And in Western Australia, I believe it's a full house there as well. I'm not 100% sure on Western Australia. There might be some percentages on that. But people are going to sport. And look, life in Sydney was normal. There was no masks, if you're on public transport, you're asked to wear a mask. But there's no restaurants, pubs, everything was open, going ahead as if before COVID. So Australia's doing exceptionally well, as is New Zealand, as you saw at the Bledisloe Cup the other day, 27,000 people, and we believe Eden Park's going to get sold out this weekend. So it's very, very different to Europe, very, very different.
Yes, it sounds like a dream right now, I have to say to you. And what are they putting that success in Australia down to?
Well, mate, they've locked the borders up very quickly. When I went back to Australia, it was a very, very strict quarantine. You were met by army and police. You were locked in your room. Food was delivered. There was nowhere you went out. You had 2 COVID tests while you're in your room, and if they weren't positive, you didn't get out. So it was very, very different. It was very tough quarantine there, and they're very solid on their tracing. It's an easier environment than Europe, but they've done a very, very solid job. Melbourne obviously got out of control. They were upwards of 700 a day there a few weeks ago, but then they shut the city down. They're back to low numbers, but the economy has taken an absolute hiding in the process. So unemployment's very high. I think it was around 9%, but they believe that's a lie. It's going to be up about 12 because all the government subsidies. They have a thing if you're job keeper and job seeker. If you're out of work, you're giving you plenty of money. If you're being laid off, the government pays the company to keep you going, but that's all ending. So the economy has taken a hit, but the health of the people is pretty good, and life is back to normal.
Okay, well that sounds great. And one last one, just out of curiosity. I mean, one of our issues is that our health service is not especially brilliant, so it's vulnerable. Is the Australian health service in good shape?
Yeah, it is. It's a very good health system in Australia, and they, like every health system in the world, they were worried they were going to be overrun at the beginning, but they've coped exceptionally well. Melbourne has coped exceptionally well, but obviously they've got a lot more cases than the rest of Australia. There's only a handful across Australia outside of Melbourne. I couldn't give you the exact number because I didn't check them last night, but again, the numbers are very, very low, and the health system is in great shape. Our frontline workers obviously carry the burden, and they have done in Melbourne, but in the rest of the country, it's as I said, life in Sydney was normal. It was nothing that you would know about being in COVID with life in Sydney.
Wow. Well, welcome to Dublin, my friend.
Yeah, what am I doing? Why did I get on that plane, mate?
Yeah, dear. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks' time in a Virgin studio. How about that? We can get into what psychological issues you're having.
Yeah,
so,
head knocks.
31,000 fans, Test Rugby back with a bang after 7 months. New Zealand 16, Australia 16. This is a 4-match series. In effect now, it's become a best of 3 after that draw. So 2 of the remaining games will be in Australia. The next one this weekend coming is at Eden Park, where obviously New Zealand don't lose. 43 matches and counting going back to 94. And if you're Australia, it's 1986 since you last won there. And as you said, we'll have the guts of 47,000 people at the game, which is quite something. We'll just work our way backwards in this extraordinary 89-minute game. Why didn't New Zealand just simply kick a drop goal?
Very, very good point. Why didn't Australia simply kick a drop goal about 60 seconds before New Zealand took a drop goal? New Zealand have done this a couple of times.
Yeah.
They don't put someone back in the pocket. They look to score a try. I'm trying to think of the test. I think it was against South Africa that they lost.
It was a high-profile one, though. It was a big game, and there was fallout from it.
Yeah, there was. And they didn't drop back into the pocket, and they didn't take the points. But again, they didn't do it. I was looking for it, going, oh, God, they've got to take it. But no one was there. No one was in that situation. And I might say the same thing. I was begging for Australia when that ball hit the upright, like just drama from that unbelievable kick, a 55-metre kick, hit the uprights halfway up, like it was a monstrous kick. And then Australia got possession back, and they worked the ball back to the midfield. And next thing I know, James O'Connor's taking the ball up, who was the out half, who should have been back in the pocket to take the kick. And then, of course, they turned it over and New Zealand go the length. So errors at both ends, mate. I can't explain it to you. I certainly would have, if I was captain or coach, get the message out, take the 3.
Is it just, it's obviously some kind of cultural thing. That's not how we do it down here almost.
It is. And I admire them for it. I have to say I admire them for it in one way, because New Zealand wasn't always like that. New Zealand, when I was growing up, were a very stodgy mob. They never ran the ball. They were a forward-based attack, and they would have taken drop goals left, right and centre. Ask Grant Fox. Grant Fox would have kicked that one straight out of the stadium into the bay there at Wellington. But they have changed, and they do play glorious rugby. But to me, that wasn't smart. In the 85th minute, they just needed to pop one over. It wasn't the smartest way to manage a game, and the New Zealanders have said that. You look, at New Zealand are often vulnerable in the opening match of a series. If you're going to boot them, you get them in that one. But they tend to improve pretty quickly, and when they get stung, they tend to react, and they obviously will react, I think, up in Auckland. But I shouldn't take away from it was a fabulous game, first and foremost, Joe. To watch it, it was dramatic. It was 4 a.m. and I'm sitting here screaming about it. It was, everyone's jumping around like, oh, and you just, it had so many twists and turns. Before the game, I feared terribly for Australia, and I am so happy that I was wrong. I thought Australia might get a hiding, and they went out and they played with a lot of courage and a lot of balls and a lot of smarts and a lot of self-belief. It was a very good Australian performance and a great game, and that's what the series needed. Like, as much as the Kiwis are blaming their own side, that's what made Trans-Tasman Bledisloe Cup games legendary, was the battle. They were so close and they were so even. And for a decade, we haven't had that. Australia beat New Zealand last year in Western Australia, but for the vast majority, New Zealand have been belting Australia for a long time, and it's lost a lot of its gloss. And games like that bring it back. It was a really pulsating game of rugby in very difficult conditions. Anyone's been to Wellington like that they call it the cake tin. You know, it's circular ground, and in the wind, it's a horrid place to play. It swirls, it ducks. The rain was coming in at 45 degrees. It wasn't showing so much on the TV, but when the camera came down to the sideline, you could see it. And both sides showed wonderful skills and wonderful intent to make it such a great game.
Australia came back from 13-3 down, if people didn't see it. New Zealand led by 5 at half time. Should have been 12. Ricky Ione dropped the ball inches from the ground. We're seeing the last couple of years some groundings where just you have to be seen to be believed. But Australia did come from 13-3 down. Dave Rennie is the new manager. We on this side of the world know him from Glasgow, where he spent 3 years and got to a Pro 14 final against Leinster, and before that he led the Chiefs to 2 Super Rugby titles. So what's Dave Rennie about, and what's he got to work with when it comes to this Australian squad?
Joe, I've been on this show over years saying how desperate things have been in Australian rugby. I'm going to say on this show now that there are signs that the big ship, someone's turned the wheel on the big ship and it's starting to slowly turn around. And that's because what's occurred with the devastation that Australian rugby's in, and the lack of leadership from Rugby Australia, and the terrible series of decisions they've made over probably a decade, it's galvanised the rugby community, which is what they lost. They lost the people who love the game. People stopped going to watch the Waratahs, the Brumbies, the Reds and so on. And they lost hope, I guess is the right way. And what's occurred is almost a reverse reaction. People have gone back to their clubs, like the AIL clubs. They're turning up in numbers to watch their clubs play. And it's sort of reinvigorating the community. And there's been a real groundswell of support for the Wallabies, not through Rugby Australia, just straight to the players themselves. And there's a businessman in Australia, and he's put some ads in the paper, some half-page ads, and they've been really wonderful, saying to the Wallabies, look, I'm just an old rugby guy, and I've set up this website because I believe in rugby, and I'm not listening to all the old guys like Alan Jones, an ex-Wallaby coach who's a high-profile media guy. He just is so negative all the time. And he said, I'm just cutting out the negativity, and I'm just going to say to you, you're representing us and we believe in you. And people have piled onto that website and sent direct messages to the team. And I think it's sort of changed the aspect of the community. And the Wallabies, instead of feeling like they've been isolated, I think they're feeling like the people are behind them, and they are. The Governor-General, the Prime Minister, everyone's been sending them direct messages to the players and has been cutting out Rugby Australia. The second part is, and I don't know Rennie well at all, the coach. I don't know him well, but I know he's hired some smart guys. The signing of Scotty Wiseman, who was Eddie Jones' attack coach, one of my former players at club level 25 years ago, and I worked with Scotty at the Australian Institute of Sport a long time ago. He's a smart operator, a good human being, and to bring him back has been a huge change. He's been given a lot of support, and the Wallabies also had a long camp in Christchurch. They had to go to Christchurch and do 2 weeks, like I've got to do 2 weeks here. They had to do 2 weeks in Christchurch. And I think they're starting to figure out how to play their own game and not copy New Zealand, not try and be what New Zealand are. They played their own style of game. And that comes back again to Super Rugby AU, where they didn't play New Zealand, the New Zealand team. They just played Australian sides. And instead of getting bashed up and beaten every week, these young players started to get confidence. And so we've got some schoolboys and under-20s from the past few years who have beaten New Zealand at schoolboy level in 20s, and they blooded them at Super Rugby Australia. And all of a sudden we've got some depth, and we've got some older guys that have played. They've brought Nick White back, who's come back to the Brumbies. There's just a little bit of a sniff of change. I still think New Zealand will win, but all of a sudden there's a change in the air, and that's wonderful. Like, our numbers are still dropping as far as participation in the men's 15 game. There's still this financial cliff Rugby Australia's on, but the rugby community is just starting to get back in touch with the Wallabies. And that's what always made the Wallabies great. They were the people you went to with your club, you knew and you supported, not as a fan, but you supported them because you knew the people. You knew what they were in. And that's been really refreshing, really, really refreshing.
Very interesting. And so that organic community-based support, which, as you said, almost bypasses Rugby Australia and bypasses the marketing slogans and all that other stuff that goes with the game. Has Dave Rennie, have the team responded to that, allowed that in, acknowledged it publicly?
Dave Rennie's done a really smart thing. Like, he's a Kiwi coming into Australia, and really, to be honest, Australians are really sick of that. They want Australians to be involved in Australian rugby. And if Dave had to come out and said what he was going to do and he was going to do this, he had been allowed about it, he would have received cynicism back. Instead, he said almost nothing, and he's let his team do his talking. And I think that has been exceptionally smart on his behalf. Since Robbie Deans came in, I personally don't agree with that. I thought Robbie Deans was a great selection as a coach. I don't care the nationality of the coach. So that's me personally. I think it doesn't matter. But people in Australia don't. Because all of a sudden, you've got the coach of the Waratahs is Penny, New Zealander. The coach of the Rebels is a South African. The coach of the Reds is a New Zealander, Brad Thorne, even though Brad was born in New Zealand and brought up in Australia. That's the way they're looking at it. The CEOs were New Zealanders. Everyone's going, hang on a minute, where are all the Australians? And there are some good Australians there, and they weren't giving them the gig. So this is, again, one of the reasons why the community left Super Rugby. They didn't feel that they had a coach or people there that they could connect to. So when I coached there, I came through the Sydney club system. The guys before me and after me all came through the Sydney club system that coached the Waratahs. So people lost that. And then they put another New Zealander in Rennie. And if he had come out and said, we're going to do this, this and that, people would have just said, shut up, mate. Stop that. And he didn't. And the boys have come out and obviously responded to his coaching. He hasn't pretended to be an Australian. He hasn't pretended to do anything, but he's got his team ready and he's got some motivation in those guys. And they played with pride. You could look at that team and it meant something to them. And I hate to say this. I really hate to say it. There was a few times in the last few years where guys were wearing a gold jersey and I don't know that it meant enough to them. It's a terrible thing to say because I can't imagine it, but just it appeared that way, that it just didn't mean enough to them. And the way those guys played last Saturday, wearing that jersey meant something. And I think Michael Hooper, the captain, has a lot to be proud of with that. He played his 100th test and he's a guy that has just been immaculate on and off the field. And he led his team magnificently. But so did guys that have been bad, like James O'Connor. James O'Connor has been a bad influence on that side as a younger man. He made a lot of mistakes. Brad Thorne gave him a second chance. And to be fair to O'Connor, he's been good. He's behaved himself, but more than that, he's been a leader. And it's something I wasn't so sure he could be. So there's a lot to like about that first game. Now, it's only a start, but there's a lot to like about it.
Eden Park looms. That won't be easy, but then 2 games on Australian soil after that. And they'll have crowds as well, we should say. So the Olympic Stadium will have about 40,000 fans in, and the Western Sydney Stadium will have 15,000, both at 50% capacity. The new coach then with New Zealand as well, Ian Foster, has been part of the backroom staff and assistant coach there since 2012. He's taken over. We look to New Zealand as thought leaders in the game. What's Foster about then?
Difficult one to answer, Joe, because as an assistant coach, he sort of took a very low profile. I thought Scotty Robinson from the Canterbury Crusaders would get the job.
Why didn't he, by the way? We were always kind of familiar with him through the Ron Nogara connection, and it seemed like he was next in line.
I don't know. I suspect, a breakdancing surfer from the South Island And I know Scott, he's a lovely man. He's a great guy. He was a great player. He was always a character. He always had a larger-than-life personality. I'm not so sure that the Auckland-based Alakadoos Blazers thought that was too hot. I still think Scott will get it. You know, Scott's done the right thing. He hasn't spat his dummy out. He's gone back and obviously put in an unbelievably good season with Canterbury. So he still has a shot with it. But, you know, to be the New Zealand coach means you can't lose. Any time New Zealand lose a game, they go for the coach. You know, and really, you know, that was it was a good performance from New Zealand, but not to their normal standards. They weren't hopeless. And there was a couple of decisions went their way, because on the other try, bringing the ball back, the first try, people aren't saying too much about. There's a big photo. I only had his foot in touch. So that first try shouldn't happen, and then I dropped the ball over the line. So they had a couple of things go wrong. But that's not the coach's fault. It's not the coach's fault. The player steps in a touch, or the player drops the ball, or they don't get back in the pocket and take the 3 points. That's an on-field leadership decision. So a lot of that to me is just New Zealand press being New Zealand press. I'd be very doubtful if the talent of that New Zealand side doesn't come through at some point. They are much more talented as individuals than the Australian side. And there are no Australians. So Australians can't go to New Zealand. So they're going to go to Eden Park. And it's just going to be full-on New Zealand. There's going to be no, unless there's a couple of Australians living there or caught there, they're not going to be anything but Kiwis there. But when they come to Sydney, it'll be 50% Kiwis, because Sydney's the second biggest New Zealand city in the world. So there's more people live there than Canterbury and Wellington. So they'll have a lot of support. But, you know, that going to Eden Park, it is pretty daunting. It's a daunting place to go. And I'll be very interesting to see how they go. This will be a big week for it. Everything says New Zealand should come back and change, and they'll be angry and they'll win there, as they've done, as Australia hasn't won there since 1986, as you're saying, since the early 90s for every other team in the world. But you never know. You know, for the good of rugby, it'd be great to see Australia play very, very well there again, and whether they can win or not. But as long as they put in a really solid performance, because the Bledisloe Cup, for the good of us rugby in Australia, it needs some life blown back into it. It needs some competition. It needs the Kiwis to not just think, we just got to turn up and we'll carry this and hold this as we've done for the last 15 years. It would be wonderful for the game if Australia can do something special. I'm not so sure they can, but it'd be wonderful if they could.
You do suspect New Zealand are coming back in a big way. Like, even Aaron Smith gave this public self-assessment after the game of the weekend. My own standard wasn't up to it. My passing was erratic, inaccurate. It gave them shots at Richie Mo'unga. It didn't give our forwards opportunities to run the ball. Things I take pride in, I need to sharpen up. Nick White had a field day. He was able to attack our defence. Having that impact in the game is something I like to do. So, I mean, you know, 3 guesses as to how Aaron Smith's going to play next week. New Zealand, generally, I don't know how much of their media you consume, Matt, but even, you know, we wouldn't have gone in with their level of expectation to the World Cup last year, and we're still sort of shaking off the disappointment probably and trying to park it and leave it behind. I presume New Zealand rugby is like probably still talking about it on a weekly basis. What went wrong?
Their media are vicious, mate. There's no other term I could use. They are vicious. Certainly nothing like the Irish media. They are relentless, and they just demand winning 100% of the time. And if you don't, they just smash you. Like the things they said about Kieran Reid after they lost that semi-final against England, it was appalling. Kieran Reid's been an absolute icon of the game, wonderful player over more than a decade, and a great person. You know, the role models that New Zealanders put out as captains, they're just wonderful human beings, and they were horrific to him.
I didn't see that. They got personal, obviously, did they?
Oh yeah, mate. I don't have a lot of time for them. I don't have a lot of time for them because they set standards that are just impossible to hold. Like, you can't. No one wins every game. No one wins every World Cup, and sure, you're going to get criticism, but they are just relentless in what they say. So if you look at this New Zealand generation, it's their first game. It's howling wind. It's a gale, and they didn't have the decency to say Australia played well. Australia, for the first time in a long time, stopped being intimidated by the New Zealanders and gave something back. And that's what I love. They were physical. They got up and they bashed them. They didn't get down on bended knee in front of the black jersey. They went at them. As you said, 13-3 down, everyone expected them to fold, and to those guys' credit, they didn't. So they didn't, and I respect Aaron Smith's comments deeply. He's a fantastic player. But there's one thing he didn't say, which he can't probably or doesn't want to. Australia didn't allow him to play. Australia gave, the Australian forwards matched the New Zealand forwards and gave Nick White the platform to do that attack. So, you know, there was some good play from Australians, and the New Zealanders are very, very reluctant to say anything good about an opposition or just to say it wasn't our day, there'll be other days. Like they're just vicious the whole time. It's their culture, and I don't like it or don't agree with it, and I don't think it's accurate. New Zealand are still a fabulous team. When they lost the World Cup semi-final, that's one of the great games of rugby. That will go up alongside the French defeat of New Zealand and the French against Australia in the first World Cup in 1987. The other game I was referring to was the 99 semi-final when France beat New Zealand, and then the semi-final from last year, England versus New Zealand. These were some of the greatest games of rugby we've ever seen. But the New Zealand press demand victory, and they don't give anything to the opposition. They just attribute failure to the men in black, and I think that's hugely unfair. Okay.
Very, very last question then. Rugby is trying to reconfigure its structure and how it's all going to pan out over the next couple of years. That includes down in the Southern Hemisphere. So working on the assumption that the South African teams are jumping into the Pro 14, I was reading that relations between Rugby Australia and New Zealand are not good. New Zealand are looking to bring in teams from Hong Kong and Hawaii and other markets, and they want Australia to come in with either 2, 3 or 4 teams as opposed to all 5 of its teams into however Super Rugby is going to look, and nobody's very happy with each other at the moment. This is all rumbling on. Will it get sorted out in the wash, or is it something more serious?
It's pretty serious, mate. I'm very surprised at the New Zealanders' attitude. Rugby in Australia, as we spoke about, is in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
There's no two ways about it. It's in financial troubles. Everything about the game in Australia, it's really bad. And the New Zealanders have sort of looked like they've given up on it and just said, well, bad luck. And they'll look to other markets, which is hugely disappointing after 125 years, where Australia has always been the little brother in that relationship in rugby union because of rugby league. Rugby league is so massive in Australia. It has 18 professional teams, where we have 4 or 5 if you bring the Western Force in. So what the New Zealanders have done, they've gone across, I wrote about it in the Irish Times, Twiggy Forrest is a billionaire, Western Australian billionaire that exports iron ore all around the world, and he's the money behind the Force, and started this rapid rugby where they go off and play all these other teams. The New Zealanders gone behind Australia's back and gone to Twiggy. Listen, bring the Western Force in, bring your money, and we'll go off and we'll run this, and then we'll tell Australia who we bring in. Now, Australian rugby's always, all those of us in Australian rugby always believed Twiggy would come to Sydney, sit on the board of Australian rugby, bring his money, bring the Western Force back. They should never have been kicked out. Melbourne's the team that should go, and we'll get on with it. But everyone's just feeling so betrayed. There's no one talking to each other. They can't actually go face-to-face and sit down around a table, have a beer or socialise, have a meal because of the COVID. And it's been very bitter. Where it ends up, I don't know. But believing that there's going to be... We believe the South Africans are gone. The Box will go somehow up north. I don't know how that's going to work. I believe they're going to come somewhere into the Six Nations. There might be a Sevens Nations. Will Italy drop out? I don't know. But the South Africans are making every noise that they're gone, they're out. And I would suspect that's the case. Now, that leaves Australia and New Zealand as the only tier 1 countries in that South Pacific. Should they set up some of the Polynesian and Melanesian countries? Absolutely. Should Japan come in? Yes. Should Argentina come in? Yes. How they do that in the post-COVID with travel, I don't know. But destroying Australian rugby in the process doesn't seem real smart. You know?
No.
Like Australia is the biggest economy by a million miles, and compared to Japan, How are you going to get Japan in? Because their rugby is still controlled by their companies that run rugby there. So NEC and Toyota, they run it. So how are you going to get them to combine and come across? There's huge problems. But New Zealand don't seem to be listening to any of that. They're just going their own way and really giving Australian rugby a good kicking in the process.
Right.
Now, that was also a motivation, I'm certain, for the Wallabies.
I'm sure it was. I saw the head of Rugby Australia describing the result, Hamish McLennan, saying it was wondrously ironic that we managed to draw after being told how rubbish we were for the last several months. We'll pick it up. Listen, great stuff, Matt. I've taken up too much of your time. I know you're busy right now. You got places to go, people to see.
Gee whiz, do you want to keep talking, Joe? I only got another 8 days and 6 hours and 15 minutes.
Man. Netflix recommendations to Matt Williams on Twitter, everyone. Help him get through this.
Absolutely. And send some wine, please.
Yes. A good red would help the night. Right.
Good wine and help the night, mate. Absolutely, Joey. Mate, lovely to hear from you. Great to talk to you. I hope to see you on TV in a couple of weeks.
Yes, look forward to it. It'll be fun. All right, Matt Williams, thanks a million.
See you, mate.
Wednesday Night Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. Team of us, everyone in.